For years, the worlds of pop and alternative music have rarely collided as smoothly as when Billie Eilish and Lana Del Rey entered the scene. Two voices generations apart, yet somehow connected by a shared darkness, a cinematic sense of melancholy that blurred the line between sadness and beauty. Before any hint of tension, before the headlines, there was only admiration, one young artist openly inspired by another. Billie Eilish was still a teenager when she began making waves in music. With her haunting voice, minimalist production, and raw honesty, she offered something new, something deeper than the glossy pop that had dominated the airwaves. She didn't sing about perfection or power. She sang about vulnerability, anxiety, and alienation. In many ways, it was the emotional honesty that defined Lana Del Rey's art years earlier. When Lana burst onto the scene in the early 2010s, she was misunderstood. Critics accused her of being manufactured, of building an aesthetic too cinematic to be real. But over time, she proved them wrong. Her music, steeped in nostalgia and tragedy, became the blueprint for a new kind of pop star, one who could be glamorous and broken at the same time. By the time Billie appeared, the industry had changed, and part of that was because Lana had changed it. Billie grew up listening to Lana's albums, memorizing the words to Born to Die and video games, and even credited her as one of her biggest inspirations. Fans noticed the parallels immediately. The whispered vocals, the dreamy production, the themes of sadness wrapped in beauty. In interviews, Billie often mentioned how Lana's music had shaped her own understanding of songwriting and emotion. Their connection seemed natural, the veteran artist and her spiritual successor. So when the two finally crossed paths in public, fans were thrilled. In 2019, when Billie's career reached global heights with When We All Fall Asleep, Where Do We Go?, she became one of the youngest artists to dominate the Grammys, sweeping major categories. The media began drawing comparisons between her and Lana, framing Billie as the new queen of moody pop. But those comparisons, while flattering, carried a hidden danger. The entertainment world loves narratives of replacement, the idea that one star must fall for another to rise. And as Billie's fame skyrocketed, interviews and headlines began to pit the two women against each other. Lana Del Rey, at that time, had already established a mature career, with albums like Lust for Life and Norman Fending Rockwell, proving her as a lyrical powerhouse. She wasn't competing with anyone, but the industry loves rivalry. When asked about Billie in interviews, Lana always spoke with grace, calling her incredible and talented beyond her years. She even said that Billie reminded her of herself, not in sound, but in spirit. Billie in turn continued to praise Lana's work. Their mutual respect seemed genuine and deep. So how did something so pure become the seed of one of the most subtle celebrity tensions of recent years? The shift didn't come from malice. It came from misunderstanding, from tone, timing, and the power of the internet to twist words into battles. In early interviews around 2020, Billie was asked repeatedly about her influences. Journalists often tried to box her into categories, asking if she saw herself as the new Lana Del Rey. Billie, who was still carving her identity, grew tired of the question. In one widely discussed interview, Billie responded to a question about comparisons by saying, "I don't want to be compared to anyone. People are always trying to make me the next someone else. I'm just me." It was a fair answer, the kind any young artist would give when trying to assert independence. But headlines spun it differently. Some outlets twisted it into a subtle rejection of Lana's influence, framing it as Billie Eilish distances herself from Lana Del Rey comparisons. Fans on social media amplified it, dissecting every word. At first, it was just noise and another media narrative. But then Lana Del Rey gave an interview of her own a few months later that added fuel to the fire. She was speaking broadly about the music industry and female artists, addressing how critics often treat women in pop. In a long, passionate statement, she mentioned several younger artists, including Billie, saying they had found success being more authentic and honest about their struggles, something she felt she was often criticized for in her early years. The line was taken out of context. What Lana meant as a defense of herself, an observation of changing standards, was misinterpreted as shade toward the new generation. Once again, social media did what it does best, turned context into conflict. Is Lana Del Rey shading Billie Eilish? Became a trending topic. Fans picked sides, arguing about who was more original, Who had paved the way? Who had copied whom? Both women stayed mostly silent, but silence often speaks louder than statements. Behind the scenes, neither seemed truly angry. Those who knew them said there was no personal feud, just the inevitable tension of two icons sharing similar artistic DNA in an industry that thrives on comparison. But online, perception became reality. Clips from interviews were edited side by side, captions were added, and theories spread like wildfire. What made the situation unique was its subtlety. There were no harsh words, no public call-outs, no visible confrontation. It was all between the lines. A raised eyebrow in an interview, a carefully worded answer, a moment of hesitation before saying another artist's name. That's why fans called it the subtle insult. To many, it symbolized something larger, the unspoken rivalry that often exists between artists who are too similar to escape comparison. It wasn't about disrespect. It was about individuality. Lana represented the poetic melancholy of the 2010s, while Billie embodied the modern, Gen Z version of that same energy, minimalism, technology, and detached emotion. Their art came from similar places but spoke to different eras, and that difference, though beautiful, created a quiet friction. By 2021, Billie had released Happier Than Ever, an album that marked her growth as an artist and woman. It was bolder, louder, and more complex. Critics hailed it as a masterpiece, and some even called it this generation's Born to Die. That phrase, meant as a compliment, reignited the conversation all over again. During one interview that year, a journalist asked Lana what she thought about Billie's album being compared to her work. Lana smiled softly and said, "I think Billie's doing her thing. She doesn't need to be compared to anyone." It was meant to be kind, even encouraging, but once again fans dissected it. Some saw it as support. Others called it passive shade. The internet's obsession with drama turned simple statements into emotional ammunition. Yet through all of this, the connection between the two artists remained oddly poetic. They were reflections of one another, not enemies but mirrors. One represented the haunting glamour of a generation raised on old Hollywood dreams, and the other, the digital melancholy of modern youth. Both explored sadness as beauty. Both challenged what a pop star could be. In truth, there was never a real insult, just a shared misunderstanding amplified by millions of voices. But that's what made it so fascinating, the way subtlety could create such a storm. As the story grew, interviews, reactions, and even fan edits became part of a cultural conversation about influence, originality, and how the music industry treats women. It was never really about Billie versus Lana. It was about how we consume narratives, how every sentence, every facial expression, every breath taken during an interview can become a headline in a world starving for drama. Still, the fans wanted more. They wanted to know what was said behind the cameras, what emotions lingered when the lights went off. Did Lana feel replaced? Did Billie feel misunderstood? Did either ever reach out privately? Those questions would fuel endless speculation. But the truth, the subtle truth, was that both women understood each other far more deeply than the internet gave them credit for. They were kindred spirits, two artists navigating fame, identity, and emotion in an industry built on distortion, and so, what started as admiration slowly evolved into something complicated. Not hatred, not rivalry, but a quiet, unspoken acknowledgement of difference. The world had already decided it was an insult, but to them, it was probably just another misunderstanding in a business that loves to turn whispers into wars. By the time the subtle tension between Billie Eilish and Lana Del Rey reached the public eye, it had already become more than just an artistic comparison. It had turned into a mirror reflecting how audiences consume celebrity culture. What began as admiration had now evolved into a conversation about influence, originality, and the fine line between inspiration and imitation. Social media became the stage where everything unfolded. Fan pages, edit accounts, and entertainment channels began analyzing their every move. When Billie posted a moody cinematic photo on Instagram, people flooded the comments, "This looks so Lana." When Lana released a softer, minimalist single later that year, comments appeared saying, "She's doing a Billie style now." It became impossible for either artist to move without being linked to the other. The tension wasn't about hostility, It was about interpretation. Every outfit, every quote, every visual choice was dissected. When Billie dyed her hair blonde for her Vogue cover shoot, many fans saw it as symbolic. The transition from her signature dark aesthetic to a softer vintage glamour that echoed Lana's early career. The internet made a narrative out of it, calling it Billie's Lana phase. Of course, Billie never said anything that supported that theory. But once a narrative takes hold online, it becomes truth in the eyes of millions. At the same time, Lana was promoting her album Chemtrails over the Country Club, a record that carried her signature cinematic sadness but also a sense of self-awareness. In one interview, she spoke about how the industry changes over time, how younger artists get more freedom to express vulnerability. While she had been harshly criticized for the same thing years before, she never mentioned Billie's name, not once, but fans immediately connected the dots. The headlines were merciless. Lana Del Rey shades Billie Eilish in new interview. Is Lana bitter about the new generation? The truth was far less dramatic. Lana was reflecting on her own journey, her struggles with being misunderstood as a woman who made sad music unapologetically. But once again, context vanished in the storm of speculation. Meanwhile, Billie continued her rise. She was entering a new phase of fame, the kind that comes with pressure, scrutiny, and expectation. With Happier Than Ever, she explored anger and exhaustion in ways she hadn't before. During interviews promoting the album, she was open about feeling trapped by the constant comparisons and public assumptions. In one particular interview, a journalist asked her, "Do you think you've replaced artists like Lana Del Rey?" Billie visibly frowned. She leaned forward slightly, her tone calm but sharp, and said, "I don't replace anyone. I just make music. People can love both of us. It's not a competition." It was an honest, grounded response, but online, it was sliced, trimmed, and shared with captions like, "Billie Eilish responds to Lana Del Rey shade." Billie finally addresses the Lana feud. Once again, the headlines didn't match the reality. The internet thrives on emotion, not context. And what made this feud so interesting to fans was that it wasn't a fight, it was a whisper, a nuance. It was two women navigating fame while trying not to step on each other's shadows. Clips from both artists' interviews began circulating side by side, Lana speaking in slow, reflective tones about being misunderstood, and Billie speaking with quiet defiance about being compared. Together, these snippets told a story that neither of them had written. Even celebrity blogs picked up the energy. Some writers described Billie as the evolution of Lana's melancholic pop, while others called her the antithesis, raw, unfiltered Gen Z rebellion. It didn't matter which side people took. Both artists' names were now linked forever in pop culture's collective mind. The emotional weight of that connection began to show. Billie, who had built her identity on authenticity, often spoke about how exhausting it was to constantly be read and analyzed. She once said, "People don't see you as a person anymore, just a projection of what they want to argue about." Lana, older and more seasoned, seemed to understand that feeling all too well. She had spent years being misunderstood, accused of glamorizing sadness, of being inauthentic, of living in an aesthetic instead of emotion. She had learned to detach, to speak less, and let her music say more. When asked directly about Billie in a 2021 radio interview, Lana responded softly, "She's doing great. I like her. She's got her own path." It was a simple, kind remark, but in the echo chamber of the internet, even kindness can sound like condescension if people want it to. Fans analyzed her tone, her facial expression, the small pause before she said Billie's name. Was it shade? Was it sincerity? Nobody really knew, and yet behind the scenes there was mutual understanding. Industry insiders have often said that the two artists actually respect each other deeply. They're both private, introverted people who prefer art over spectacle. Two women shaped by similar pressures in different decades. Still, the fan-created tension didn't die down. It grew into a quiet competition of aesthetics. Billie's fashion choices began leaning toward more classic and feminine styles, and critics noticed the overlap with Lana's aesthetic. Pearls, silk, nostalgia, softness. Fans called it Lana-inspired. Others argued it was just Billie evolving naturally. It wasn't just about looks, though. It was about narrative control. The subtle insult, the one that headlines kept repeating, was never a single sentence. It was a collection of misread moments, half-phrases, and accidental parallels. Each time Billie defended her individuality, it was framed as shade toward Lana. Each time Lana reflected on the new generation, it was framed as bitterness toward Billie. The reality was far less cinematic. The insult existed only in interpretation, but perception has power. When millions of fans discuss and replay a moment, it becomes real in the cultural memory. A glance, a sigh, a soft laugh during an interview. All of it became part of the mythology surrounding them. In one viral clip from an awards show, Billie was seen sitting in the audience while Lana performed. Cameras caught her watching quietly, expression unreadable. Within hours, Twitter threads appeared saying Billie looked unimpressed. Others argued she looked emotional. Nobody really knew, but it didn't stop the theories. That moment became symbolic of how their rivalry existed entirely in people's imaginations, not in reality. Two women simply existing in the same space, both successful, both emotional artists, and yet the world demanded tension. As 2022 arrived, the narrative reached its peak. Fan accounts began posting timeline videos of the so-called feud, complete with dramatic music, captions like "the subtle insult that changed everything," and out-of-context clips. The more you watched, the more you realized the story was built from nothing but fragments. Still, it resonated because it represented something deeper about pop culture. How we crave conflict, even between those who've given us nothing but vulnerability and beauty. Billie and Lana had become symbolic opposites, youth and maturity, rebellion and reflection, Gen Z and millennial. But under the surface, they were telling the same story in different languages. Both sang about sadness not as weakness but as art. Both challenged what femininity could look like in music, raw, flawed, human. That's what made their dynamic so powerful. The subtle insult wasn't just about them. It was about how society struggles to let women exist without comparison. When one rises, people look for the fall of another. When one speaks, every word is weighed like a weapon. Lana had endured it for years. Billie was now living it in real time. And in that shared experience and that invisible pressure lay the true bond between them. They didn't need to talk about it publicly. They didn't need to explain it to anyone. They both understood what it meant to be turned into a symbol of something bigger than yourself. The story wasn't really about insult or shade. It was about identity, about what happens when two powerful voices mirror each other too perfectly for the world to process. The stage was set for what would come next. The moment fans would later call the interview that said it all. A single exchange broadcast worldwide, where words weren't needed to feel the tension, where silence became louder than speech. That's where the real spark would ignite, not through confrontation, but through understanding, emotion, and a camera capturing every breath, and that moment would define the rest of the story. By the time the interview happened, the tension between Billie Eilish and Lana Del Rey wasn't something either of them had openly acknowledged, yet it had already taken on a life of its own. For months, social media had been dissecting every soundbite, every headline, and every glance they shared at public events. It was only a matter of time before the two would appear in the same space, under the same lights, with cameras ready to capture every flicker of emotion. It wasn't a confrontation, at least not in the traditional sense. It was supposed to be an artistic conversation, a televised roundtable hosted by one of the biggest music magazines in the world. The format was simple. Pair two influential artists from different generations and let them talk about creativity, fame, and the pressures of the industry. On paper, it was brilliant. In reality, it was a cultural moment waiting to explode. When the announcement dropped, Billie Eilish and Lana Del Rey in conversation, the internet lit up. Fans flooded timelines with excitement and anxiety. Would this be the moment they addressed the rumors? Would the subtle insult finally come to light? Both artists arrived separately. Lana, elegant as always, wore a cream-colored silk blouse, her expression calm and unreadable. Billie walked in later, dressed in her usual effortless style, relaxed, slightly oversized beige attire, her hair neatly tied back. There was no visible hostility, but in the quiet moments before the cameras rolled, observers noted the tension in the air. When the host began, the atmosphere was polite, even warm. They discussed music first. Lana spoke about her early inspirations, her love for cinematic storytelling, and how she viewed songwriting as emotional archaeology. Billie listened attentively, occasionally nodding, her gaze steady but serious. When it was her turn, she talked about how she writes from instinct, how she rarely plans songs. They just happen. At first, it was mutual respect on display. Both praised each other's artistry. Lana smiled when Billie mentioned Born to Die as an album that changed her understanding of music. Billie laughed softly when Lana called her one of the few true lyricists of her generation. But as the conversation deepened, something shifted. The host, perhaps sensing the public curiosity, brought up the elephant in the room. "You two are often compared to each other," he said. "How do you feel about that, and does it ever get frustrating?" The air tightened. Lana was the first to respond. She leaned slightly forward, her tone thoughtful but measured. "Comparisons are natural," she said softly. "We're women in music. They've always done that to us. I used to be compared to people I didn't even know. It's fine, but sometimes it takes away from your individuality." Billie nodded, but there was a flicker of something behind her eyes. Recognition, maybe even exhaustion. When she spoke, her voice was calm but firm. "Yeah, it does get frustrating. I love Lana. She's amazing. But people act like I can't exist without being someone's version of something. It's like, why can't we both just be what we are?" It was an honest statement, not meant to offend. But the tone, the slight emphasis on both "just be what we are," lingered in the air. Lana smiled politely, though her eyes seemed to reflect 1,000 quiet thoughts. The camera caught that moment, that millisecond of pause, and it became history. The conversation moved on, but the energy had changed. It wasn't cold, just heavy, like two people navigating shared territory that neither wanted to claim. The host, perhaps realizing he'd struck a nerve, shifted topics to songwriting and authenticity. "Billie," he asked, "you've been called the voice of a generation. How do you handle that kind of pressure?" Billie shrugged, her signature gesture of humility mixed with honesty. "I don't think anyone should be called that," she said. "I'm just a person. I make what I feel. Sometimes people think I'm trying to be deep or mysterious. I'm not. I just say what's true for me." Then came Lana's response. She nodded, smiled faintly, and said, "That's good. I used to say the same thing, but people didn't believe me back then." The room fell silent for half a second. It wasn't an attack. It was a truth, but a sharp one. Billie looked at her, a small, almost imperceptible raise of the eyebrow. It wasn't disrespect. It was acknowledgement. She understood exactly what Lana meant, that the industry had changed, that Lana had walked so others could run. The audience watching at home, however, saw something different. They saw a moment. That subtle exchange, 2 sentences, 2 gazes, became the subtle insult heard around the world. Within hours of the interview airing, Twitter exploded. Clips of that brief dialogue went viral, racking up millions of views. Fans divided instantly. Some said Lana's comment was a soft reminder that she had endured the criticism Billie never had. Others said Billie's earlier tone sounded dismissive. In truth, both women were simply speaking their truths, but tone is a dangerous thing when millions are listening. Headlines the next morning were merciless. Lana Del Rey throws shade at Billie Eilish during joint interview. Billie Eilish's awkward reaction to Lana's comment goes viral. What made it even more intense was how quiet both women remained afterward. Neither posted about the interview. Neither clarified their words. That silence and that refusal to feed the fire only made the flames burn hotter. Clips of Lana's soft smile after Billie's statement circulated endlessly. People slowed the video down, analyzed her expression frame by frame. She was definitely annoyed, some claimed. No, that was her being supportive, others argued. Even body language experts chimed in, creating videos titled, "The Hidden Meaning Behind Billie and Lana's Exchange." But behind the scenes, those who worked on the interview later said the two were cordial, even kind once the camera stopped. They thanked each other, hugged briefly, and left separately. There was no hostility, just two artists who had shared a very public, very human moment. Still, perception ruled. And perception became legend. That short conversation became symbolic, not because of what was said, but because of what it represented. It wasn't really about Billie and Lana. It was about generational tension, about how one woman's struggle becomes another's freedom. Lana Del Rey had faced a decade of criticism for being too sad, too dreamy, too artificial. Billie Eilish, years later, was celebrated for that very same authenticity. It wasn't Billie's fault, it was the evolution of culture. But to many, Lana's soft remark carried the weight of years of unfair double standards. That's why it struck so deeply. It wasn't an insult. It was a sigh. Billie, meanwhile, felt the aftermath differently. Her fans rallied behind her, defending her right to grow beyond comparisons. She said nothing publicly about the moment, but days later, during a live Q&A, someone mentioned Lana's name. Billie smiled faintly and said, "She's great. I've always respected her." That was it, no drama. No shade, just calm acknowledgement, but of course, calmness doesn't trend. Clips of her brief answer were edited with dramatic music. Captions like "Billie responds to Lana after interview tension." Views soared. Comments multiplied. The subtle insult narrative was reborn, more powerful than before. Meanwhile, Lana kept doing what she always did, retreating into her art. She released new music, soft and introspective, filled with lines about misunderstanding and silence. Fans dissected lyrics, claiming hidden references to Billie or the incident. Maybe there were. Maybe there weren't. Art, after all, is always open to interpretation, and so the story continued to live on, not through their words, but through ours. The insult that no one expected had become one of the most analyzed pop culture moments of the decade. Yet neither Billie nor Lana had ever shown animosity. It was all projection, the world's reflection of its own need for conflict placed upon two women who, ironically, represented peace and introspection. When you watched that interview closely, really watched, what you saw wasn't a feud. You saw two artists grappling with the weight of perception, the pain of being misunderstood, and the impossible balance between respect and independence. In that quiet tension, there was truth, a truth about how art evolves, about how generations pass torches, even when they don't mean to, about how admiration can turn into comparison, and comparison into confusion. Billie and Lana's brief exchange became more than a viral moment. It became a symbol of how the industry treats women's narratives, as battles instead of conversations, as hierarchies instead of continuums. And in that one look, that one subtle insult that wasn't really an insult at all, the world saw everything it wanted to see. But the story didn't end there. Because what came after would surprise everyone, the way both artists responded not with words but with action. And that's where everything changed. The days following the interview felt like a storm that wouldn't end. What was supposed to be an honest, open conversation between two artists became one of the most dissected moments in recent pop culture. Every social media platform was filled with opinions, theories, and emotional think pieces. The clip, that one brief moment of eye contact, that single exchange, was replayed millions of times. The internet called it the look that said everything. But what exactly did it say? That was the question that kept everyone guessing. Billie Eilish, who had grown up in the age of constant online commentary, seemed to handle it with quiet strength. She didn't post cryptic quotes or take subtle jabs. Instead, she went silent. And in the digital world, silence often speaks louder than any statement. For nearly 2 weeks, Billie stayed offline. No interviews, no Instagram posts, no tweets. Her fans began worrying while tabloids spun new angles. Billie Eilish retreats after Lana Del Rey interview backlash. But those who knew her understood. She wasn't retreating. She was processing. Lana Del Rey, meanwhile, continued promoting her music. She gave another interview, calm and composed as always. When asked indirectly about the viral moment, she smiled faintly and said, "I think people like to make stories. I have nothing but love for Billie." Her answer was poised, elegant, and perhaps the final word needed to end the supposed feud. But it didn't. The internet wasn't ready to let go. That's the thing about modern fame. Once a narrative catches fire, truth struggles to keep up. Fans on both sides continued defending their idols. Every new quote, photo, or facial expression reignited the debate. In a way, the situation revealed something much deeper about the culture of celebrity. The public doesn't just watch artists anymore. They curate them, project onto them, turn them into symbols of their own ideas. And Billie and Lana, whether they liked it or not, had become symbols of two eras colliding. Lana represented reflection, slow storytelling, cinematic emotion. Billie embodied immediacy, intimacy, and raw realism. Together they formed a spectrum, two ends of a shared truth. Still, behind the scenes, both women were affected by the noise. Billie's team reportedly urged her to make a statement to clarify the situation, but she refused. "If I explain it," she told a friend, "people will just twist that too." Instead, she turned her focus back to music. A few months later, Billie began teasing a new project, darker, moodier, and more personal. The visuals were minimal, the tone subdued. To some, it felt like she was processing something unspoken, a quiet rebellion against the media's obsession with her every word. Meanwhile, Lana released a poetry collection and a stripped-back music video filmed in her backyard. No big budget, no filters, no spectacle. It was art in its purest form, and fans who truly understood her saw it as a subtle reminder. She didn't need to compete with anyone. The beauty of the moment was how both artists responded, not through confrontation, but through creation. Instead of fueling the so-called feud, they transformed the conversation into something artistic. The subtle insult, once a viral sensation, began to take on new meaning. Fans started seeing it not as shade, but as a shared moment of frustration, honesty, and mutual respect. The online narrative slowly evolved. Some called it the most graceful non-feud in music history. Others said it symbolized how women in the industry can coexist despite the world trying to pit them against each other. And maybe that was the truth all along. As months passed, the noise faded. Both women returned to doing what they loved, making art. But the echoes of that interview lingered in fan culture, inspiring essays, podcasts, and even university discussions about the way fame distorts reality. Then something unexpected happened. At an awards show later that year, both Billie Eilish and Lana Del Rey were nominated in major categories. It was the first time they had attended the same ceremony since the interview. Cameras were everywhere, waiting for a moment, any sign of tension or reconciliation. When Billie arrived, dressed in a sleek black suit, she looked confident, yet calm. Lana, radiant in a soft pastel gown, arrived minutes later. They didn't cross paths on the carpet, but fate had something else planned. Midway through the ceremony, Billie won an award, Best Song of the Year. As she walked up to the stage, the camera briefly cut to Lana. She was smiling, clapping sincerely, no hesitation. When Billie took the microphone, she thanked her team, her family, and then paused. "I also want to thank the women who made it possible for artists like me to do this," she said. "People like Lana, she changed everything. She made this kind of music possible." The audience erupted in applause. Lana's expression softened, a genuine warm smile. It was the kind of moment that transcended gossip. For the first time, the narrative shifted. The internet, for once, celebrated kindness instead of conflict. Fans who had once argued now shared the same clip under captions like, "Full circle. This is how respect looks." The feud that never really was. That single moment, that single sentence undid months of speculation. It reminded everyone that both women were human, imperfect, emotional, but deeply respectful of each other's art. And behind that public peace, something else began to take shape: mutual understanding. Industry insiders later revealed that after the ceremony, Billie and Lana spoke briefly backstage. It wasn't dramatic or staged, just a quiet, heartfelt exchange. Lana reportedly told her, "You're doing beautiful things. Don't let anyone change that." Billie smiled and replied, "You did them first?" 2 sentences, no cameras, no headlines, just mutual respect between two artists who had been through the same storm. The beauty of it all was that their supposed feud had actually brought them closer in spirit. Both had been misunderstood. Both had been criticized for being too sad, too different, and too real. They shared the same emotional landscape, even if their sounds were distinct, and maybe that's why the public was so obsessed with them, because they mirrored something inside us. The quiet tension, the unspoken emotions, the need to be seen for who we really are. In the months that followed, the cultural memory of the insult softened. Fans began creating edits celebrating both artists together, split screens of Billie's minimalist music videos beside Lana's cinematic visuals, captions like "Different eras, same soul." For once, the internet wasn't trying to tear two women apart. It was celebrating them side by side. Both artists continued thriving. Billie with her introspective songwriting and evolving image, Lana with her timeless lyricism and poetic vision. But beneath all the fame, the awards, and the viral moments, there remained a quiet truth. They had both survived the noise. What began as misunderstanding had become growth. What began as silence had become understanding, and the subtle insult, the one the world couldn't stop replaying, had transformed into something unexpected. A shared lesson in dignity, because maybe the real story wasn't about the moment itself. It was about how both women handled it. Without anger, without ego, without spectacle. They reminded the world that maturity doesn't always need a microphone. Sometimes it just needs grace. As time passed, new artists emerged and the spotlight shifted once again. But the story of Billie and Lana remained, a reminder of how media can twist meaning, how fans can shape narratives, and how truth always finds a quiet way to return. It was proof that even in the loudest industry in the world, silence, when chosen, can be the most powerful response of all. And that's why, years later, people still talk about it. Not as a feud, not as gossip, but as a moment of humanity. Two generations crossing paths, misunderstanding each other briefly, then finding connection in the end. The subtle insult that no one expected became the quiet reconciliation that no one saw coming. When the noise faded and the internet found its next obsession, what remained was something far more meaningful: perspective. Months had passed since the so-called subtle insult, yet the story of Billie Eilish and Lana Del Rey continued to live on in quiet corners of the internet. Not as gossip, but as a conversation, one that touched on creativity, respect, and how women in music are constantly misunderstood by the narratives built around them. In an industry built on spectacle, the idea that a single look, a single pause, could dominate headlines was telling. It wasn't really about what was said. It was about what people wanted to see. And that's where the story of Billie and Lana transcends its own controversy. Because at its core, it wasn't about a feud at all. It was about perception. For Billie, the entire experience became a lesson in control, not of others, but of herself. She had learned early in her career that silence could be both weapon and shield. During that time, she discovered how easily meaning could be twisted, so she stopped trying to correct people and started focusing on what she could control: her art. Her next album, released the following year, reflected that growth. Gone were the dark whispers of rebellion. Instead, she embraced vulnerability. The songs were stripped down, filled with honesty, discomfort, and moments of light. Critics called it her most human work yet. Some even suggested that the maturity in her voice came from the quiet wisdom earned through the Lana moment, the understanding that being misread is sometimes part of being seen. Lana, on the other hand, had already walked through her share of media fire. She'd been criticized, misunderstood, idolized, and then reinvented, sometimes all within the same week. So when the Billie narrative erupted, she recognized it for what it was: noise. In later interviews, Lana reflected on how fame magnifies even the smallest gestures. "It's like a mirror house," she said. "You see 10 versions of yourself and none of them are you." That quote resonated deeply with both fan bases. It wasn't just about celebrity. It was about identity in the age of social media. Because that's what this story ultimately revealed, that in today's world, perception is its own form of power. The public had turned an ordinary interview into a battle of eras, the melancholic poet versus the experimental prodigy. But behind the narrative were two artists who never wanted a fight. They wanted to be understood. Over time, their fans began to evolve too. What started as fandom rivalry transformed into appreciation. TikTok edits and fan essays started shifting tone. Instead of Lana versus Billie, they began celebrating Lana and Billie. Clips of the two artists were paired side by side, showing how both had influenced each other indirectly. Billie's minimalist darkness beside Lana's cinematic grandeur became symbolic of how art evolves. Not through conflict, but through connection. At one point, Billie mentioned in an interview how she admired older artists who weren't afraid to be soft. It wasn't a direct mention of Lana, but fans knew what she meant. And when Lana later said, "I love seeing young women make music that isn't afraid to sound vulnerable," people caught the reflection. Two mirrors facing each other, not rivals, but reflections of the same emotion. Behind the curtain of social media, these two artists had taught the world something profound. That misunderstanding doesn't always end in resentment. Sometimes it leads to awareness. That's why, years later, when fans look back at the infamous subtle insult, many see it differently. Not as a spark of drama, but as a turning point. A reminder that real artistry isn't just about harmony or perfection. It's about tension, honesty, and the messy beauty of being human. Even the industry began to take notice. Commentators started referencing the Billie Lana moment in discussions about media framing, calling it a prime example of how women's interactions are often sensationalized. One journalist wrote, "If two male artists had exchanged that same glance, it would have been called professional respect. When two women do it, it becomes a feud." That observation stuck. It became a conversation starter about how the public consumes women's stories, and how the smallest moment can be blown out of proportion simply because it involves power, beauty, and influence. In the end, both Billie and Lana carried on gracefully. Their music continued to top charts, their visuals continued to inspire new generations, and their individuality remained intact. But in interviews, something had changed. Both artists spoke more openly about self-protection. Billie began advocating for emotional boundaries online, saying, "You don't owe the internet an explanation for every look on your face." Lana, ever poetic, expressed it differently. Sometimes silence is just self-respect. Together, they became silent advocates for a new kind of fame, one rooted not in constant accessibility, but in intentional distance. And that's what makes their story so powerful. It's not the scandal that defines it. It's the growth that followed. Years later, when fans look back on the clip that started it all, it feels almost surreal. Two artists sitting across from each other, unknowingly becoming part of a digital legend. But if you watch closely now, knowing everything that came after, the award moment, the quiet exchange backstage, the evolution in their music, you see something different. You see humanity. Two people trying to communicate in a world that constantly misunderstands them. It's a reminder that sometimes what looks like insult is actually introspection. What sounds like shade might really be the sound of two generations trying to understand each other. The story ends not with a scandal, but with empathy. And maybe that's what makes it unforgettable, because behind every headline, behind every explosive moment the media sells, there are real people, flawed, creative, emotional, and endlessly misunderstood. Billie and Lana's story proved that no matter how loud the world gets, integrity doesn't shout. It whispers. As time moves on, new artists will rise, new headlines will come and go. But this one, the subtle insult no one expected, will always stand out. Not because of what was said, but because of how both women handled what wasn't. They showed the world that grace is stronger than gossip, that silence can carry more power than confrontation, and that sometimes the best response isn't to fight back, it's to rise above. And so when people remember this story years from now, they won't remember the viral clip, or the interviews, or the theories. They'll remember the message, that in a world obsessed with drama, two women chose dignity instead. That in a culture that profits from conflict, they reminded us what empathy looks like, and that in the end, the real legacy of Billie Eilish and Lana Del Rey wasn't a feud, or a controversy. It was a lesson in humanity, because the subtle insult no one expected turned out to be the subtle connection everyone needed.